In this video, we're going to show you to install control arm bushings on your Toyota Camry located in your lower control arms. Use a pry tool and go ahead and pop off that center cap. Set that aside. Use a 21mm socket to go ahead and loosen and remove the lug nuts. Remove the wheel and set it aside. Using a 15mm socket, we're going to go ahead and loosen and remove the nut on the lower portion of our sway bar end link. Loosen and remove the upper sway bar end link nut. Pop that out. Loosen and remove the nut for the tie rod. If your tie rod doesn't pop out that easy, go ahead and strike the side of the knuckle here, and that should release that unit. You can go ahead and set that aside. Using a pair of pliers, go ahead, remove your cotter pin here. Cotter pins are a one-time use, so make sure that you have a replacement cotter pin. Go ahead and remove this, set it aside. Using a 30mm socket, loosen and remove the axle nut. Once you have that nut loose, I'm going to go ahead and push on that axle and make sure that this is free floating. If this is stuck, you can go ahead and use a punch in the center. You want to go ahead and loosen that axle from the splines from the inside of that wheel hub. Use a 12mm socket or wrench to loosen and remove this bolt for the flex hose. We're going to remove the two 22mm nuts from our strut bolts. Now, if the nut and the bolt spin, just use a 22mm wrench to hold this side while you loosen the nut. And at this point here, we have free range here to go ahead and move our knuckle around. I want to go ahead and remove this here and then push this in, and you can remove the lower bolt. Now you want to hold this, and now we want to go ahead and work on pushing the axle out of the wheel hub. So push that in as far as you can. You're going to slowly start to release the knuckle forward and pull that axle out from the back side. We want to go ahead and use our 19mm socket on the ball joint nut here. We did spray it with some rust penetrant, so we want to go ahead and try and break this free. Now sometimes there may be a cotter pin that goes through the castle nut. Ours is so rusted that the cotter pin is either just rusted in there or it's been broken off. We're going to go ahead and try and spin this. So now that we have this nut removed, I want to go ahead, I'm going to position my axle towards the rear. Let that drop down a little bit. And I'm going to raise this back up. I'm going to install a bolt. The purpose of doing this is when we separate the control arm from the knuckle, the strut will hold the knuckle in the brake assembly and it will not pull on your flex hose here. I'm just going to go ahead and tuck my tie rod end out of the way a little bit. We're going to use a hammer and strike right here on the knuckle. I'm also going to use a pry bar pushing on the knuckle on the control arm to go ahead and get that to separate. There it is. We can see that the knuckle is separating from the ball joint. Let's go ahead and lower our vehicle down. Using a 17mm socket, let's loosen and remove all three of these for the ball joint. I'm going to use our pry bar, flex the control arm down, pop out the ball joint. If you follow the control arm back, you're going to find your 19mm bolt right here. Let's go ahead and loosen and remove that. Now our bolt was spinning. Now if your bolt is spinning with the nut on top, it is a 19mm. I'm going to use an open end wrench. Pop that in there. Let's go ahead and loosen this. Now on the top here, go ahead and pull this nut out. There's normally a lock tab on here that just kind of bent, so I had to use that wrench on there. Control arm here bolted to the subframe, two 19mm bolts here. Then we'll go ahead and remove these two bolts and set those aside. And spin that control arm out. Now in order to go ahead and get this bushing in, well, we have to remove the one out of the arm here. Now this is in a particular position and the bushing is affixed to the mounting point itself. So if you install this and it's crooked, that is not a good thing. You need to make sure that this gets pressed in as close as possible to this one here. I'm going to use a crayon and we're going to go ahead and mark pretty much in line here. And then I'm going to flip it. I'm going to mark it on this side as well. Next thing we want to do is we want to try and press this out somehow. We're going to cut this side of the bushing with a blade because we can only push this bushing out this way here. We can't push it in. It'll hit the arm. So we're going to use a blade here and try and cut this off and all the way around. Next thing we want to do is we're going to spray some lubricant down inside here. Hopefully it'll seep down inside, loosen up that bushing, and we're going to put this into the vise and start to twist this back and forth. Now as you're doing this here, pay attention to the crayon mark. You want to make sure that those don't rub off or wash off. We use our pry bar. Now it's okay if we tear that bushing inside. Our main goal is just to get this out. Once we get that out, we can clean up the rest of the rubber on the inside of the control arm. All right, so that's spinning around pretty good. Let's see if we can use the pry bar to try and work this up. All right, well, that's very satisfying to get that taken out. Go ahead and dispose of that. Now in the inside hole here on the control arm, you want to go ahead, put your hand in there and see if there's any type of rusty, flared up metal. And I have a little bit right around the edges here that's going to cause some restrictions when I go to put that new bushing in. So I'm just going to use a little bit of an abrasive pad on my drill here to clean the outer edge here. If yours is excessive, you can use a chisel to go ahead and just chunk that rusty stuff out. And then follow up with some 120 grit sandpaper on the inside to clean it up. You want this to be pretty smooth on the inside so you can press that new bushing right in. So I do a little combination of this with the sandpaper. So on our arm, we found it to be a little bit more rusty than we anticipated. We ended up using some 80 grit sandpaper here to try and break that rust down. So just continue to do this here so you can clean everything up. And then once we have this cleaned up, we'll go ahead and get the bushing pressed in. Now this bushing is designed to go in one way. It's tapered on this side here. So this is the side that's going to get pressed in. We're going to use some silicone paste here. This is going to be a very tight fit. Now we have our bushing lined up and we have a cup on the bottom here. We're going to spray this with some solvent and spray this as we pump this down and in. As we're doing this, we're making sure that our unit here, our bracket, is lining up with the unit, with the line that we have on there. Now we got it in so far, it's probably bottomed out, so now we need to release this and we'll have to reposition. We're going to continue to do this until we can get this fully seated. Now we have our bushing pressed in and the bracket or the mounting point here is lined up with the yellow mark that we have on our arm. We're going to go ahead and release this here. Get to remove this. We can see here that our bushing is pressed in all the way right here, which is good. Now this bushing here that we're going to be replacing is pressed in a particular position. You can see that there's a slot here and a slot here. We also want to pay attention that the bushing itself is pretty much even on both sides when it's pressed in. So I'm going to use a crayon and I'm going to mark the center of this slot and the center of this slot. There, when we press in the new one, we'll know how that's got to go in. If you put it in a different way, it will change the handling of the vehicle adversely. So you don't want to do that. Make sure you press in the new one the correct way. So we have a cup on the bottom. We're going to press that down through the top. And at this point, we're going to go ahead and continue to press this bushing through and it'll fall through into this cup. Once you do that, we can go ahead and switch over, install the new bushing, and we'll press that one back in. Now here we switch over to our vise here. Now I was showing you could use a cup to go ahead and press that out if you have access to a press. If you're at home and you don't have a press, you can take a knife and cut the rubber around the perimeter here and just push out the center, and then use a hacksaw blade and just cut the metal sleeve and then just pop that out. Now if you happen to have an air tool, an air chisel, air punch, something like that, you can go ahead and just work your way around the back side here and zapping this here a little bit to go ahead and pop that out. And what you want to do is work your way around the perimeter, working that out as even as possible. There you have it. Inspect the inside, make sure that there's no rusty nuggets or anything in there. You want to go ahead and clean that up. You can use some sandpaper. If you have it, you can use 120. We happen to have 80 grit right here. You just run around the inside, clean that up a little bit. Give that a quick wipe down. Now remember, installation of the new bushing, we have our yellow marks. They should be directly across from one another. That is where our little gaps here, our little spacers in the bushing are going to go. So that would pretty much go in just like that. You can use your vise to go ahead and press this in as well, or you can use a press to go ahead and do that. Let's go ahead and get started with that. Now in our case here, we found it's going to be best for us to press this in on our press. I'm going to continue to press this down until just the upper edge of that bushing is just about flush with the edge there of the control arm. Once you have this pressed in, you can go ahead and get that installed. Now we have this pressed in and we have that slot lined up with our yellow mark on the control arm. Let's go ahead and get the control arm installed. I'm going to insert the back portion of our control arm into the subframe. Swing this around. And you'll have to manipulate this knuckle around a little bit to get that to line up over here. Now we have two bolts here. The longer bolt goes on the back side, short bolt on the front. Now we're just gonna work this into place a little bit better. We can use a pry bar. Work that up. You can see we can kind of flex that, get those holes to line up. Drop that in, see if we can get that started, a couple threads. Give it a tug. Yep, that's caught. Let's go ahead and get the forward bolt lined up here. Once again, just kind of move that pry bar with that bolt moving around. Now, could you have removed the complete knuckle and removed that off to the side? You could have, but it's easier just to support everything here without disassembling all the brakes. Okay, we're going to leave these loose. Let's go ahead and get the rear bolt installed on the back side of the control arm. Now at this point here, I want to go ahead and line up the hole with the control arm and the frame. It's not quite going in yet. You can use a screwdriver or something round to go ahead and kind of get in and move that arm over. We're just going to tap our control arm around a little bit to get this bolt to line up in there. So we put our nut on the top here to lock that into place. And we're just doing this by hand to make sure that we don't cross thread anything. At this point here, we can go ahead and tighten that bolt down. Go ahead and use our impact gun for that. And we'll come back and torque that down after. Let's now go ahead and lower the vehicle and get the ball joint installed. Now we're installing our pry bar through one of the holes in the control arm. We're going to use this as leverage to bring this down. So I want to bring this down. Watch out for your CB axle boot, so make sure that is out of the way. Bring that down, install the ball joint. You can release that control arm. At this point, we can install our bolts and nuts. We'll install the 2 nuts first. And then we can go ahead and maneuver the back part of that ball joint up against the control arm to get this rear bolt installed. Back with the pry bar. Now when doing a job like this here, you definitely want to start these nuts and bolts by hand. If you put a power tool to these right away, you have a high probability of cross-threading these and just opening up a huge can of worms. And there we have it. We have all 3 started. Let's come on back. We'll tighten these in, securing that ball joint to the control arm. Now we did tighten these down. We do also want to torque these into position. Let's torque down the ball joint nuts to 94 foot-pounds. Torque the rear bolt to 152 foot-pounds. Use our wrench up top here to keep that upper nut from spinning. Going to install our nut here. Now I want to pay attention to this stud here, and there's a hole in it for our cotter pin, and ours is running through here and coming out the front side. I'm going to install our nut. Once we get that started, we can go ahead and tighten that down. Now I'm just going to go ahead and put our tie rod end on just like this. That's going to keep our knuckles straight, and that way there I can go ahead and torque that nut to 90 foot-pounds. We're going to install our cotter pin. In this case here, because it hits the back side of the knuckle, we're going to start to roll these. As we feed that through. On this top tab, I'm going to roll over, tap that down, and then we cut off the excess. Now for some reason, if you go to tighten this nut and you torque it and the holes don't line up, you want to go ahead and continue to tighten the nut until the next notch in the castle nut lines up with it. Never loosen this nut for it to line up. Always tighten it to the next notch. That's all set. Pop that. I'm going to remove our lower bolt here. That'll allow us to go ahead and swing this. Feed that axle in. At this point, we're just going to work this to get this lined up. It'll take you a little bit of time to finagle this in. Here we go, get that bolt in. Now we can get the lower bolt installed. Get those nuts on. We're just going to go ahead and get these started. I'm going to go ahead and snug down the control arm bolts here. Go ahead and torque these bolts down to 152 foot-pounds. Let's tighten down our strut bolts. Let's torque these bolts to 156 foot-pounds. Install our bolt for our flex hose. Let's go ahead and snug that down. Install that tie rod in, get that nut installed. You can snug that down. Torque the tie rod nut down to 36 foot-pounds. Go ahead and install that end link. Good, tighten down these nuts. Torque these down to 29 foot-pounds. Go ahead and position that wheel. Make sure that that axle is all the way through. Install your axle nut. Let's go ahead and tighten that down. I'm going to install 2 lug nuts. Now we lower the vehicle, for us, we lower the vehicle down. I'm going to use our pry bar, like so. I'm going to torque down this axle nut to 217 foot-pounds. Remove the pry bar, remove the lug nuts. Now that this nut is torqued, I'm going to install the crown here. Make sure you obtain a new cotter pin. Feed that through. Going to bend over our upper tab here. Snip off the excess. Now that you've completed this here, you want to go ahead and install the wheel. Take this vehicle for road test. You definitely want to bring it down and have an alignment performed after having this work done. Go ahead and take your wheel. Line up those studs there. And get our lug nuts started. Once we have all of these on, we'll go ahead and snug them down. Go ahead and torque your lug nuts down to 76 foot-pounds. Do this in a crisscross or a star pattern. If you have a hubcap or a center cap, go ahead and install that now. And you're all set.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.